with Flory making this decision and entering at the portal, that it opens up a Pandora's box of possibilities.
Yeah.
And like you mentioned earlier, depending on how you look at it, that could either be potentially still maybe okay, but it could also be really, really, really bad
Yeah.
for Kansas, because I think you highlighted it perfectly. Like, the odds of Kansas finding an equal caliber player in terms of ceiling is, I would say, virtually non-existent. Paid all who enter, and beware of this podcast. That's right. This is the Paid Podcast, an emergency episode on a Saturday night with some breaking news here on the show. I'm Nick Springer, of course, here with Kevin Flaherty. We're brought to you by Emprise Bank, your partner and possible member, FDIC. And we're going to try to navigate the tricky situation that has unfolded over the past basically 12 hours at this point, depending on when you're listening, or on Sunday morning over the past 12 hours on Saturday afternoon and into Saturday evening. And that is the unexpected news of Kansas freshman Flory Bidunga entering the transfer portal. This came from Pete Thamel. I'll just read the tweet directly from Pete Thamel that came out earlier on Saturday afternoon. Kansas big man Flory Bidunga has informed the staff that he intends to enter the transfer portal per sources. Returning to Kansas remains a strong option. Bidunga is a former top 20 recruit who played well as a freshman at Kansas. First and foremost, the thing that certainly sticks out in this tweet from Pete Thamel is the returning to Kansas remains a strong option. And This is where the situation gets very muddy, because I think if you separate, there's two factors here at play, right? You've got obviously the financial aspect, which has become a big part of things. And then you also have the other aspect, which is basically everything else that's not the money, right?
Yeah, sure.
If you look at this decision from the standpoint of what happened with Flory at Kansas this season, he broke out a little bit, played really well, had some nice games, kind of floundered a little bit down the stretch, but obviously KJ Adams played a lot and was a big factor for Kansas. Bill Self had a lot of trust in KJ Adams, and that in some ways probably did impact a little bit how much Flory was able to play this season and how much he was able to grow. But beyond that, if you look at what he could being a part of going into 2025, you're talking about being a cornerstone piece of a roster that involves a potential number one NBA draft pick in Darren Peterson. Darren Peterson himself actually said when he was in Lawrence that he was most excited to play with Flory Bidunga. Actually, funnily enough, he had a comment about that when he was playing in Lawrence at Haskell. And so from that standpoint, you would think that Flory would be set up to be in a really great position at Kansas, to be that cornerstone piece, to be, part of a two-man tandem of really, really elite players as a returner, and then pairing up with a freshman Darren Peterson, and then whoever else Kansas might potentially look for in the transfer portal to build around them. But I think the general thought process, at least from the outside, was, hey, you've got a dynamic freshman big man who is more than likely poised to take a big step forward in a sophomore season, and bringing in a potential number one overall draft pick who's going to be handling the point. Those are two really great pieces to have, and you go from there. So if you look at it from strictly that aspect, this certainly seems to be a bit of a puzzling move, I think would be the best way to describe it. And then, of course, you get into the financial aspect. Just a quick little backstory here on Flory Bidunga. Obviously, he's originally from out of the country, played his high school basketball in Indiana, has some guardians and his group of people, as every player does in this age of college basketball. Everybody has usually an agent or guardians, fans, parents, family members, whatever, that kind of helps them through this process. Because a lot of times we're talking about literally kids in some cases as well. And so when you take that into consideration, and when you take into the consideration what this kind of means for Kansas and what it means for Flory Bidunga, you start to wonder, is money playing a big factor? And Shreyas Lotta did some really good reporting from the Kansas City Star, a friend of the show here, Shreyas, and he had a quote from one of Flory's guardians that suggested this, and here's the direct quote: Kansas remains strongly in consideration, but at the same time, we don't know what the roster is going to look like next year. Flory can pick. We're going to be with Katie tomorrow. This was speaking on Saturday afternoon. But we have to have options because the transfer portal is going to move. So that is an interesting choice of words as well from that standpoint, Kevin. And I certainly want to get your take on everything that I'm describing here. because that makes it seem like, hey, if you really want to come back to Kansas and you're trying to leverage for more money in this era, entering the transfer portal to me is a very, very risky move that could burn a lot of bridges very quickly and sort of could potentially isolate you, I guess, if you're looking at it from that perspective. So I don't know. Obviously, it's some major breaking news. I do want to talk more about what it could mean for Kansas if Flory does not return. But first, just your reaction to this sort of bizarre situation that has seemingly unfolded more or less unexpectedly for the most part over the past 12 hours on Saturday afternoon and the Saturday evening.
Yeah, I think, there are a lot of things at play here or that you can circle. And I thought you did a great job sort of breaking down the different pieces of the puzzle because let's be honest, other than the people directly involved, we don't know 100% what everything is. And to be fair, things are rarely so black and white, right, Nick? Like it's probably a little from column A, a little from column B, a little from column C, a little from column D. There's maybe a little bit of frustration of, hey, you had what? I think 4 games in January. KJ Adams' injury, obviously, a part of that, where you played 25 or more minutes as freshmen, when you make that sort of leap and you're playing that much, your playing time doesn't usually drop, right? It's usually, hey, you're kind of locking yourself into these opportunities. He never played 25 minutes again after that point, and he had, I think, a couple games where he had 20 or more minutes where he played like 20, 21, 21. I think over a small stretch, but his role certainly diminished. And you look at, he played 29 minutes against UCF when he had a double with 10 points. He never scored double digit points again the rest of the season. And so, yeah, part of that puzzle can be frustration with, hey, we felt like he had earned more playing time, like he had earned a bigger spot in the rotation, whether or not KJ Adams was there. And that can be a portion of this. You can also look at it like you've talked about from a financial aspect of, hey, this is where we're at in today's college basketball of, yes, you know, coming back would be a great opportunity and all those different things. The best way to leverage yourself financially, just strictly financially, is to get more bidders, right? To say, hey, I'm going to put myself on the open market. Auburn's bid was 2.5 million. Can you make 2.6? Just strictly from a business financial perspective, that could be part of it too, where you open things up where somebody can legitimately have conversations with you and say, this is where we value you. And then you can come back and find out if Kansas values you at or around or possibly even exceeding that same level. There's also the uncertainty aspect to your point of, and kind of what they said of, hey, we don't know what this roster is going to look like. I personally tend to think I'm right there with you where it is puzzling because you look at it from, I think, our perspective, and we're going to look at it from an optimistic perspective of you've got these 2 great cornerstones, and one of them is Flory. That's a tremendous opportunity. You're playing with an NBA level point guard who's going to be terrific in pick and roll. That's going to make you look better. That's going to be better for your NBA stock and all of those things. But you could also look at it from Flory's perspective of who's going to shoot the ball. Like nobody's signed on that you feel like, hey, this person is going to space the court. Am I going to be dealing with, paints where 5 guys are in the paint and I'm not going to look good in that situation? And so there is some uncertainty there when you look at it from a glass half empty standpoint of you say, hey, I'm not saying no. I'm just saying I want to know what the roster looks like a little more so that I'll know that it's more than just me and Darren Peterson, and I'm going to have to carry the slack with not a great roster. And so I think that all of those things can be factors to some extent. Ultimately, like I said, even if you go into it feeling like, hey, this is strictly financial, I don't know that there's a bad guy involved in that, Nick, with where we're at in college basketball, because players should be able to get what people think that they're worth. And whatever Kansas's offer is, if it's top of the line, it's the best offer he could get. Great. If it's not, then he has a right to look for an offer that's better, even if you just look at it from a financial perspective. The other thing that I agree with you with, and I've talked for quite a while now, but the other thing that I do really agree with you with is the most intriguing part of that, and the part that I would kind of circle with multiple exclamation points, is the Kansas remains a strong option. If this were just about, hey, we're mad about this happening, hey, you're not making enough money, let's get out, that would be one thing. That doesn't appear to be what this is, Nick. I do think that to some extent, you don't want to say the ball's in KU's court, because obviously the decision-making ball is in Flory's court, but I think Kansas still has some things that it can do to ensure that Flory Bidunga is a Jayhawk next year.
Yeah, but my counterpoint to that would be, if that's the case, then why make this move? Why bring him into the portal? Why not
just wait?
Yeah, why not just see what Kansas? I mean, I understand maybe if you go do it this way, you're going to have a chance to get more clear offers from other teams, possibly more quickly. But yeah, to make it so public like this, and honestly, the more I think about this, Kevin, like, this is not going to be a quick process. Like, this is not going to be resolved. And when I say quick, I mean within like the next week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, right? Like, this is probably something that's going to become drawn out. And that just, you talked a lot about uncertainty. Well, that gives obviously Kansas a lot of uncertainty. If you think about what KU's looking at, and they may say, you know what, we're just going to punt on this whole thing and decide we are going to go try to find guys that we think are going to want to stay at Kansas and not have to deal with this. You know, are you 1 foot in, 1 foot out? Where are you at? You know, is it about whatever it may be about, you know? So there's a lot at play, obviously, that continues to unfold, and it continues to impact how this Kansas team will look in 2025. I want to touch on that, maybe talk a little bit about where we think this team might be if Flory is gone versus if he ends up deciding to come back. Plenty more on that as well. But we're going to take a quick break. Before we do, got to tell you about our friends over at Home Field Apparel. You know what? Regardless of who's on the team, you can always support with Home Field Apparel, and you can look good doing it at homefieldapparel.com. You can use that promo code PAYHEAT24 for 15% off your first order. 40-plus Kansas items. KU baseball just got a big win on Saturday. Kevin was actually there on Saturday, so maybe if you want to hear a little bit of firsthand experience of what it's like to be at the Hog, you can hear from Kevin as well. So, but you want to look good regardless, and it's summertime. This apparel is cool, it's comfortable, and it's clean. You'll look good, and you'll feel good at wearing it. So use that promo code PAID24 for 15% off your first order. More KU basketball talk is coming next. Looking for tickets for your next event? Tickets for Less is your number one source. Save big on every purchase when you use promo code KCSN at ticketsforless.com.
Success in real estate takes more than vision. It takes the right financial partner. When someone takes something rundown and turns it into something great, that's called a comeback story, like Brain Group. They take distressed properties here in KC, completely rework them, and then turn them into valuable real estate. But that kind of work needs the right bank behind it. Enter Emprise Bank. They're not about cookie-cutter loans. They saw Brain Group's vision, backed them, and now they're making big moves in Kansas City real estate. Talk about your partner impossible. Emprise doesn't do one-size-fits-all financing. They invest in potential and back growth. Visit emprisebank.com/KC to learn more. Emprise Bank, member FDIC, equal housing lender.
This is the Paid Podcast on the Kansas City Sports Network. I'm Nick Springer, here with Kevin Flaherty. As always, brought to you by Emprise Bank, your partner in all things possible. And this is a bit of a breaking news episode late Saturday night as we record, with Flory Bidunga announcing that he's going to enter to the transfer portal from Kansas. A potentially significant loss for KU when you start to think about the puzzle pieces being put together for the 2025 roster. So you'll definitely want to, now is as good of a time as anything, to subscribe and keep your notification bells on so you know when our episodes drop. If there is going to be more breaking news over the course of this transfer portal cycle, which, considering how this thing kicked off, Kevin, I can only imagine what it's going to be like news-wise over the next month or so. So you'll definitely want to stay subscribed on audio platforms, Apple, Spotify. You can leave a 5-star rating and review. And if on our YouTube channel at Kansas Jocks KCSN, you can subscribe there as well. You can drop a comment. Tons of ways to stay connected with the show, to share your thoughts. Obviously, this is something that could have major ripple effects for Kansas going forward. As that is the big news. Flory Bidunga on Saturday afternoon announcing that he is going to enter into the transfer portal and what that could mean for Kansas. And again, it's a bit of a sticky situation, I would say. There's a lot of different factors at play, as always with these types of things. And now it's, you mentioned it, Kevin, the decision ultimately comes down to Flory and his camp, but there's also now a decision, I think, to be made on the Kansas side of this, right? Okay, how hard do we want to consider bringing Flory back? How much could it potentially cost? Do we just maybe punt on the whole situation and start to look around elsewhere for other options going forward? We spent quite a bit of time talking about the needs that Kansas has going into 2025, and that was a pretty long laundry list to begin with. And if you add a starting caliber 5 player to that list, that could be even more significant for Kansas and what they might have to do this upcoming season. So I don't know where are you at with that, and what could this mean for KU going forward if indeed Flory Bidunga is not going to be a part of this roster going into 2025?
Yeah, Kansas all of a sudden may have to get a CYA 5, and pardon the expression, for those of you who don't know, cover your ass, and it's funny, but it is one of those things where KU, when they roll out the ball, Nick, they've got to have a starting 5. Like they have to have somebody who can line up in that position. And whether you think Flory is going to come back or not at this point, if this thing starts to stretch out a little bit, you really have to evaluate, okay, how do we feel about this? Because we can't be left holding the bag. You can't be in a spot where Flory decides to go elsewhere near the end of the transfer portal, and you're sitting here saying there's no options. And so I think that there's definitely some risk assessment here for Kansas, where you needed to get 5s anyway because you needed to get somebody. We talked about it on our roster building show. You probably wanted to get somebody who could back up Flory and then potentially play with Flory at times, maybe a 5 who could shoot the ball a little bit. But all of a sudden you're looking for a little bit different player, aren't you? You're looking for somebody who could maybe be your starting 5 if push came to shove and you really had to go in that direction. As far as what KU could look like without him, Nick, I think KU has a chance to be better both offensively and defensively next year. And we've talked a lot about offensively. Darren Peterson, DeJuan Harris, I do think gets more of a bad rap than he deserves. We've talked about this on the show, but he was a flawed player. And one of his flaws was that he didn't score from the point guard position. And a lot of Self's best teams have had point guards who could put the ball in the basket on a consistent basis. All of a sudden, you not only have a guy who can score at the point guard position, you have a guy who will score in Darren Peterson. And Peterson can set up other guys as well. But I think that piece is going to lead to better offense because you're going to be able to score from the point guard position and put pressure on defenses from that spot. Now, the reason I think that they could be better defensively is we saw the last couple of years that Hunter Dickinson, as good as he was offensively, as good as he was for the most part on the glass, he had some defensive weaknesses that people could exploit, especially teams that ran high pick and roll stuff. He didn't necessarily have the lateral quickness to get back under the basket, wasn't a great rim protector, wasn't necessarily a great defender on the perimeter in general. And Flory can do all those things at the 5. And so all of a sudden, what Peterson is offensively in terms of increasing your versatility in the way you can do things, I think Flory kind of completes you defensively in a similar way. And so if you don't have Flory, it's really hard to see them getting a big man that can check those defensive boxes. And we haven't even talked about what Flory could bring offensively in terms of on the offensive glass as a role guy. I think the skill is going to develop relatively quickly with Flory because he seems to be a very mentally quick guy who picks things up. But defensively, I think is the real area, Nick, where all of a sudden you kind of lose your defensive backbone. And you have to almost start thinking about how are we going to be able to defend without an NBA caliber backline defender, protecting the ring?
Yeah, with Flory making this decision and entering at the portal, that it opens up a Pandora's box of possibilities.
Yeah.
And like you mentioned earlier, depending on how you look at it, that could either be potentially still maybe okay, but it could also be really, really, really bad for Kansas, because I think you highlighted it perfectly. Like, the odds of Kansas finding an equal caliber player in terms of ceiling is, I would say, virtually non-existent. And so that raises a very scary prospect for KU. And that kind of ties into the conversation of how badly do you maybe want to try to bring Flory back versus, is it too much of a headache at this point with dealing with the money situation, or is that really all that it's about? Does it really only revolve around that? And if so, what, is there a tipping point in terms of cost or price, or, all that stuff that I'm very happy I don't have to figure out, but that there's somebody on the KU staff and within KU that has to try to iron all that stuff out and to make those decisions. And yeah, it raises a lot of uncertainty for this Kansas roster going forward if you don't have that secondary piece at the big man position that you can build around, right? Like, the idea of, I think I used this exact phrasing on a previous show. The idea of Flory with Darren Peterson is tantalizing, right?
Yeah.
And the idea of removing either of those pieces, whether it's Flory or Darren Peterson, taking either one of them away from each other, it kind of becomes a house of cards. The whole thing falls apart, really, in terms of what you maybe are hoping to see from Kansas going forward. So, yeah, it's a very, very scary proposition for Kansas, and obviously that puts them in a tough spot. And again, I would reiterate, this is not a process that I think is going to resolve itself quickly, right? I don't think Flory is going to wake up tomorrow and say, yeah, you know what, I'm coming back. This is not going to be something that's going to happen in a very quick timeline, which really adds another layer of complexity to the whole situation for Kansas and what they want to do and where they want to go, because you're still pursuing players already in the transfer portal and you still don't even know who you have in-house, right? And so more guys from Kansas could enter the portal as well. We'll see, but certainly Flory was one that I don't think was really expected to leave, at least at this stage of the offseason. So potentially a huge blow for Kansas. And again, we'll just kind of have to wait and see how it unfolds with how Flory navigates it, how his camp navigates it, and how KU chooses to navigate it as well.
Yeah, and I think having more information is always better, right? Like having more players locked in. I think with each player that KU would add through the portal anyway, if you're looking at possibly adding like a Josh Dix, for instance, all of a sudden, hey, you've got Peterson, you've got Flory, you've got Josh Dix. These are the two pieces that we need around them to fill in those other gaps. Now, all of a sudden, you take Flory out. What if there's a 4-man out there, Nick, who can't shoot but is really good at bowling his way to the basket? You probably wouldn't take that guy to play next to Flory, but if you aren't sure that Flory's in the basket, is that guy automatically disqualified, or is he somebody that maybe now you're kind of considering a little more? You don't have all the information where you can say, let's fit this lineup around each other and figure out how all these pieces work. All of a sudden, that's a question mark where you almost look at it as maybe Flory at the 5. And so,
yeah,
and that becomes a problem in and of itself, because if you're out there, maybe you can get a star at the 4, but you can't at the 5. But the guy at the 4 isn't a great shooter necessarily. And maybe if Flory comes back, you're not necessarily looking for a star at the 4, but you're looking for more of a complementary piece, like a stretch 4 or somebody that is going to shoot well, but maybe doesn't need the ball a whole lot. It really impacts your whole roster building strategy.
Yeah, and this goes further to sort of hammer home the point of it's still the wild, wild west right now. You can do anything. Anything is on the table, which as frustrating as it is, I think probably from a fan perspective, it's probably equally or more frustrating from an internal perspective, right? From a coaching staff perspective, from a player perspective. But like you said, also at the same time, like if a player feels that they should be able to get value for what they're worth, they should have that right. And I think I agree with you on that. But this is sort of the less pretty side of that
Sure.
of that sentiment, basically, when you consider it. So let's take a quick break real quick, and then we'll wrap this conversation up. Maybe hit a couple other notes on more transfer portal updates as well for Kansas. And again, where they kind of stand now and where do they try to go from here. But we'll take one more quick break, and we'll be right back.
Thanks for listening to KC Sports Network. Make sure you download our new app. Find it on the App Store or Google Play. Just search KC Sports Network.
This is the Paid Podcast on the Kansas City Sports Network. I'm Nick Springer here with Kevin Flaherty, again on a little bit of a breaking news episode. Our first real breaking news episode of this transfer portal cycle came earlier than probably expected, and also came on a subject not fully expected, which is Flory Bidunga planning to enter the transfer portal and potentially depart Kansas. Although, again, with that sort of messaging of returning to Kansas could be an option. I don't know how much I buy into that right now with Kansas being an option, considering, this is a real substantial step, basically, in terms of a negotiation or whatever, however you want to view it. But something to consider. But the point being, there's going to be more breaking news, and you'll want to stay up to date. And that means you need to subscribe. Subscribe on our Apple and Spotify for audio, on our YouTube channel at Kansas Jacks KCSN as well for news, analysis, updates, and breaking news, and so on and so forth. And thank you so much if you have already. And, leave us a shout out, leave us a 5-star rating and review, or drop a comment on our YouTube channel. Tons of ways to stay in contact with the show, as always. Like we talked about with Bidunga potentially leaving, that raises a lot of question marks for Kansas. You mentioned it, Kevin. Josh Dix continues to be a target for KU, a 6'6" 3-man out of Iowa. We'll see where that goes for KU as well, and probably start to add more targets to the board from a 5-man perspective because of the circumstances that they find themselves in with Flory. But another name that it has popped into the portal that I think is a lot of KU fans will find intriguing for a lot of different reasons. That's one Keyshawn Hall out of UCF. And if you're a Kansas fan, I'm sure you're certainly already familiar with this individual out of UCF, because he dropped over 30 points on Kansas at Allen Fieldhouse and almost led UCF to an upset win. Oh, and then, by the way, he went to the Big 12 tournament against Kansas and dropped over 25 points there as well against Kansas, and almost found a way to help UCF win there. So he's somebody that is intriguing. And again, as that 4 position, he's the type of player, Kevin, that with Flory on the roster, maybe you look at it differently versus with Flory off the roster in terms of how highly of a target you would want to, or how highly of a priority you would want to make a player like Keyshawn Hall.
Yeah, I mean, Keyshawn Hall is a guy that would seem like almost a hand in glove fit next to Flory, because he can stretch the court some. He's somebody that can handle the ball. He rebounds really well. He's a guy that's physical. But I'm not sure, Nick, that Keyshawn Hall's the best defender. And when you look at his splits on that, and they aren't nearly as pretty. If you have a guy like Flory that's going to provide the defensive boost, especially around the rim that he is, you 100% take Keyshawn Hall. I mean, I'd take Keyshawn Hall anyway, but it seems like he fits better with somebody like Flory that could maybe help make up for that a little bit. And so I think it's kind of funny. I know, I'm pretty sure you and I have talked about it, but I tweeted out when Keyshawn Hall was going nuts against KU. I said Keyshawn Hall transfer to Kansas challenge, and then of course he hits the portal, and so he's definitely a guy that I would have circled multiple times on the board. And I do think, though, while I would take him either way, I do think that his fit is stronger with Flory versus another 5-man that maybe isn't going to give you the level of defensive protection that Flory's going to give him.
Yeah, and that just adds more to this discussion, right? I mean, without Flory potentially on the team, and again, I just keep circling back to that point of if returning to Kansas remains an option, this is sort of like hitting the nuclear codes button in a lot of ways, right? To like put your name in the portal like that. Like, if this was something that you were seriously wanted to stay at Kansas, like, I don't know that you would take this extreme of a jump at this stage. But I guess that's the decision that's made, and now Kansas kind of has to move forward from there and determine what that may look like. Again, probably going to be more relating to this unfolding over the course of the coming days and weeks about where Kansas goes from here. Again, it's I think from that side perspective, it can be so easy to say, well, if he wants more money, just give more money and everything's fine. Or if he wants more playing time, just give more playing time and everything's fine. It's certainly not that simple. I think you definitely know that, Kevin. That there's so many different factors involved while it sometimes may seem like an easy fix to just do one thing or give one thing or up a little bit more money or whatever it may be, it oftentimes is not. And then again, you couple that with, I mean, how do you think the Kansas staff feels right now? Probably feels like they were a little bit, stabbed in the back, or there was a lack of trust or communication there involved with how this unfolded. So lots of things to consider for Kansas moving forward.
Yeah, 100%. And I think it's there's an urgency about this season, right? And a lot of that is because KU hasn't had a great season the last couple seasons, not a great tournament the last 3 seasons. Obviously, Bill Self wasn't in the tournament for one of those seasons going through his health issues, but that NCAA tournament championship in 2022, it's getting a little bit further and further into the rearview mirror. And so there's a little bit of added urgency with that. The big part of the urgency, and I think you would agree with this, is the fact that Darren Peterson looks like the best guard prospect that's come along in quite some while. And so you feel like you're only going to have Peterson for one season. And, Bill Self had those health issues a few years ago. Who knows how long he wants to continue to coach. It certainly feels like this is a throw everything at the wall to make it work type season, to make it work around Peterson, to make it work with Self, who again is getting certainly into the twilight years of his career, and to make it work when you've had a few years that maybe haven't quite lived up to Kansas expectations. And so because of that, there is such this urgency to make sure that everything works. And to your point, I'm just throwing random figures out here now. So please, nobody write down this, as Kevin said, whatever. If Flory is making $1 million and somebody thinks he should be making $3 million, that's $2 million that could be going elsewhere too, and could be going potentially even multiple elsewheres. And so there's not a salary cap per se, but there is a limited amount of money. Nobody has unlimited money. And so while you're in a spot to say, hey, we want 2025, 2026 to be the year around Darren Peterson, go win a national title, give Self another, trophy case moment, all of these things, a legacy season, if you will, there's still constraints there, and you still have decisions to make in terms of what you're willing and able to do. If there weren't any constraints, it would be so easy to just be like, hey, do whatever it takes, bring Flory back. And, I still think you're probably hedging more on that side of it anyway, and saying, hey, Flory is a really valuable piece, try to do what you can to get him back. But the flip side of that, Nick, is that it's not like KU just has a $25 million check to build out next year's roster. And so, and I'm not even saying it's all financial. I'm just saying there is a point of diminishing returns where you have to make the really tough choice and say, okay, yes, maybe you can get this done, but are you cutting back in other areas that would really limit your ability to compete for championships as well?
I think urgency is the perfect word to use to describe this 2025 transfer portal cycle that we're in now, and then heading into the season for the reasons that you outlined. Darren Peterson is the big number one reason, because a presumed top 3 pick in the NBA draft in 2026. That's a guy you're going to have for 1 year and he's done. You mentioned it with Bill Self. Yes, I echo that. Bill Self realistically doesn't have that many years left to coach. I don't think that's not groundbreaking analysis or anything like that, but that's just kind of the reality of where it's at. And so you looked at it with Darren Peterson coming in and say, hey, yes, things have not gone very well the past couple seasons, but we have this elite NBA caliber talent coming in. We know Self can still coach and still get it done. Yes, all in on this season. And Flory was a big part of that, unfortunately. I think a big part of that calculus prior to Saturday. And so now you've got to try to redraw the lines of battle and figure out where Kansas goes from here. But yes, I think the urgency certainly is felt. I think it's palpable. And I think that's also that and urgency is also certainly, especially with the Flory news, adding to the levels of anxiety, I think probably in and around the program as well. So that's a factor also. But there's going to be plenty more breaking news shows. And again, we're going to be talking about it. We'll be covering KU basketball. We'll be continuing to talk about KU football as well as they wrap up their spring football season as well. And you can find all of that right here on our show on Paid on KCSN at Kansas Jacks KCSN on YouTube. And you can subscribe, of course, on our audio platforms as well. So, yes, while there's a sense of urgency for Kansas, Kevin, we urgently insist that you subscribe and or drop a comment, leave a five-star interview, share your thoughts, and join in on the conversation with us. But that's going to wrap it up, I think, for this Saturday night breaking news episode of the show. Thanks so much for joining us again to help you kind of go through this situation with. I mean, it's up and down right now. It's a little bit touch and go. But Kevin, you got any final thoughts before we wrap things up here?
No, I think we pretty much hit on it. I think there were a lot of Kansas fans who went from the Josh Dix visiting news saying, I love the transfer portal, to quickly saying, I hate the transfer portal, potentially even over the course of about a 24-hour period. The transfer portal giveth, the transfer portal taketh away. But in this case, Flory does not appear to have been taken away just yet. So there is potentially, if you're looking for that little, silver ray of hope, there is still that out there. And so it's something that's going to bear watching. And for those of you that decide that, hey, I hate this, I don't like the era of basketball, this is not going to be the last time that if this winds up happening. It's probably going to become fairly regular that even players who are somewhat happy may wind up reopening, putting themselves in the portal to kind of field offers, both from not just monetarily, but opportunity, what kind of rosters are out there that can, that they could join, et cetera. And that you have to make your case in order to get them out of the portal and bring them back to your school.
For the record, I personally do not like this era either. But I do like you all for joining us today. So thanks so much for tuning in again. Join the conversation with us however you would like to. And we're going to be continuing to talk about this, talk about more roster building, talk about the transfer portal, plenty more over the course of the coming weeks. And again, we'll be talking KU football as well in the spring. So if you're looking for a football itch, or if you're maybe looking for something to brighten your day a little bit as opposed to some of the negative transfer portal talk, you can check that out as well. So be sure to check out all of our shows on our feed, both on audio and on our YouTube channel at Kansas Jacks KCSN. Subscribe as well. That's going to wrap it up for tonight's show. Until next time, he is Kevin Flaherty. I'm Nick Springer. We'll talk to you all again soon. See ya.